Kant was very deeply convinced that there is such a thing as moral action. Moral action means that a man chooses or can choose to do right as opposed to wrong, to put it in very simple terms. And that there was no merit in choosing what was right unless there was a possibility of choosing what was wrong. And if man was totally determined, not only by external factors, biological or physical, but also by what might be called internal factors, psychological, for example, his desires, his wishes, his inclinations, then, according to Kant, he was a mere turnspit, as he called him. He was like a clock, which, of course, moves in a perfectly regular fashion, but not determined by itself, but determined by some mechanism over which it has no control. What he was really opposed to was Spinoza's idea that a stone, which is flung by somebody, if you ask it why it is flying where it is flying, supposing it were conscious of what it was doing, might answer that it was doing so because it wanted to, but in fact, it can't help it. It's really the thrower who determines its direction. For Kant, this cancelled morality altogether. He thought that this was true of the physical world, but if it was true of the moral world, then goodbye to morals. For him, morality consisted in the power of choice.
This does raise the very interesting question, doesn't it, when you deal with those who are considered to be criminally insane. That is, they are mad bad, and therefore curable, and those people who are just bad, who are just criminals, and are seen to be responsible for their actions, and therefore are punished for those actions.
I don't know whether if you're considered to be totally incurable, then of course you are more or less regarded as a kind of medical object, whether you're put in jail or in hospital. I think that isn't quite perhaps the division which one ought to draw. The division is between people who think whose acts are supposed to be caused by environment, by bad education, by other factors which can be adjusted by a kindly and wise psychologist or sociologist, as it were, and acts which are regarded as, in some sense, free, for which the man is responsible. And the whole notion of responsibility is at stake. Kant, whom I mentioned already, took a very extreme position about this. He thought that punishment was fundamentally retributive, which is now regarded as the most brutal and irrational position by many liberal-minded and progressive thinkers. He thought that because he thought that the idea that punishment is corrective, or the idea that punishment is educational in character and alters your character, is insulting to the man himself. In some sense, the corrector, the psychologist, is regarded as the man who knows what is good for the man, which he himself does not. And therefore he's being treated like a sick man or a child. This may be required in some cases where you are dealing with children. There's the ungrown-up people who are not fully aware of the facts, who are in some way not adult, or perhaps people who are really aberrant, that's to say, who are psychologically in some way, as we would say, pathological or abnormal. But to regard all human beings as being in that condition appears to him to deny what he regards as the most human of all human attributes, which is the power of free choice. And he says, in effect, that generosity, for example, and paternalism, even used for the most noble purposes, can be an insult to man, can be a terrible form of tyranny, that indifference, even hostility, recognizes the equality of the person towards whom you are hostile or about whom you are indifferent more deeply than the attempt to condition him, to mold him, to do something to him, which he's regarded as incapable of doing himself. I mean, I've known people who've committed antisocial acts who are quite clear about the fact that they'd rather go to prison than to hospital. To go to prison means that at least they know there is a punishment attached, and they've done it all the same. They know perfectly well that society is against it. They maybe agree with the laws of society and defy them openly, or they may disagree with them and think the laws are immoral or wicked. But at least they know what they're doing. They do things with their eyes open. As opposed to being sent to hospital, the implication of which is that they are in some way psychologically feebler, inferior to, understand the world less well than the people who are in charge of them.
This would be true of homosexuals, particularly.
Yes, and while there were anti-homosexual laws in England, certainly some homosexuals I've met were proud people who said they knew what they were doing and they would rather be punished than treated as pathological cases.
How often do you think that this argument about human nature, that is, a collection of people sit down and decide this is human nature, this is what we can expect from man. On the side you have what is natural for man and you have what is unnatural. So to be a homosexual, to come under the heading of any other number of aberrations, you are unnatural, and therefore to be cured, to be coerced into naturalness.
Well, of course, I mean, one must begin by saying that some very dogmatic and some very crude views of human nature have been held and have done a great deal of damage. If you thought diabolical possession was very important, as you did in the Middle Ages, then when people behaved in perhaps hysterical fashion, they were beaten. They were beaten and they were maltreated in order to drive the devils out of them. It took some time for people to realize that perhaps the causes of such behavior, whatever they might be, were not supernatural in character, and therefore that the treatment advocated by religious persons were mere cruelty. But at the same time, I have to say, all moral theories and all political theory rests on some view of human nature. In the end, it boils down to that. When you compare this morality to that morality, this moral philosopher to that moral philosopher, or this society to that society, if you research sufficiently scrupulously and deeply, you will find that there is some concept of human nature which underlies it. And there have been several concepts which have clashed with each other. For example, in the ancient world and in the medieval world, the Judeo-Christian world, so to speak, and indeed in the ancient Greek world too, it was assumed that all things had purposes. Inanimate objects, animate objects, men, all had some kind of inbuilt purposes. If you were a theist, you believed that God created you for a certain purpose. If you were not a theist, you talked of nature, not necessarily as creating, but being, filled with objects with certain purposes. The great thing was to discover what is the purpose of a stone. The purpose of a stone is to gravitate downwards. For Aristotle, every object seeks its natural end. That's called teleology. If you think that everything has a proper purpose, then you say full realization of an object or a person is the attainment of that particular end. And that's what makes people happy. Why are people miserable? Because they don't understand their ends and they try and do something for which they're not adapted. I am a violin player and I try to play the flute. That's no good. I wish to construct a violin, I try and make it out of stone, it will not yield because I don't understand the purposes of stones, the purposes of violins, or my own purpose as a player. And this, of course, is also the Christian idea of a kind of hierarchy, in which God is at the head and the perhaps the amoeba, when it is discovered, is below, and there is a whole hierarchy, so to speak, of beings, each of which seeks to attain its own purpose, and if they all attain their purposes, they're in harmony with each other. Disharmony arises when people wander away from their purpose through error, through blindness, through perversity of some sort, through misfortune sometimes, perhaps. And then they have to be put right, adjusted, put into a proper bracket, so to speak, and then it's all right. And people like Hume, who was highly empirical, still believed something not unlike that. He thought there was a nature, mistress nature, dame nature, which always came to one's aid when one was in some way distempered. Hobbes did not believe this on the whole. Spinoza didn't believe it. This was a great break. The idea that things don't have ends. The only people who have ends are men who make things for certain purposes. Clocks don't have ends. The end is imposed by me. Men don't have inbuilt ends. They simply seek what they seek. When they're rational, they seek rational ends, and if they're irrational, they seek irrational ends. If you understand what the world is like, you will see what is likely to compass your ends, what is likely to fulfill them, and what is likely to frustrate them. But there's a terrible, complete contrast between people who think that there are objective ends built into things and men, and people who say things are what they are. They're simply a mechanism. They just exist and are causally determined. And ends are things which human beings just conceive and can abandon.
Where does freedom, though, where does the sense that man is a self-actualizing entity? This is the Sartre argument, isn't it?
Well, certainly it is. That, of course, is what Kant is in favor of. That's where it comes from. It comes from Kant and Fichte and these German philosophers, for the most part. Though there were people in the ancient world, Epicurus, I think, probably thought that we were free in some way. All determinist theories flow from the Stoics, and all libertarian theories flow from the Epicureans, historically speaking. You see, the Stoics are the first people who really saw the dilemma, the awful agony. They were the first people who, on the one hand, believed that there were certain things which people had to do. I don't say they called them duties, but things which were proper for men to do. And therefore they had to choose. On the other hand, they also believed in rigorous causality, and they didn't know how to get out of this. They were the first people to be in this bind. And one of them then says, well, we can solve it this way. We can say men are involved in this. They're not just pushed about by external causes. If a sphere rolls down an incline, the fact that it rolls down the incline is due not merely to the incline, but also to the fact that it is spherical. When men act in certain ways, it isn't only that they're being pushed by external causes, it is also they have a certain character. They're involved, their nature, they're involved in it. If they're involved in it, they're free. Kant rejected this absolutely, said this was a miserable subterfuge. Either you were determined or you were not. The fact you were determined by your own nervous system or by your own emotions or by your own desires didn't make you any freer. But he and people like Sartre certainly suppose that this whole metaphysical notion of everything being rigorously determined, whether by empirical causality or by some kind of metaphysical structure, was simply something which human beings invented, at least for Sartre, in order to justify all kinds of acts which they fundamentally suppose not to be right.
Also, it seems that it does justify the structure of society as well, doesn't it? Very nicely. The view of a hierarchy, a concept that everybody has their place, that human nature, God or whatever it is, history, has determined that people will have a particular function. Then you have your people at the top and your people in graduated classes down to the very bottom. Now, this does form a very good justification for injustice, inequalities, and things of this sort.
Well, and perhaps for justice too in some cases, but the thing is that it's cozier that way. If you aren't fully responsible for your own acts, if you can say, I am as I am because my parents maltreated me, I am as I am because the nature of the universe is such, and then you put the responsibility on the back of the universe and shuffle it off your own. And this, ultimately, people don't want to be all alone, lonely persons responsible for their own acts. They want some justification of what they do from the nature of something greater, more stable, in a way grander than themselves. And if they can say, I fulfill the will of God, or I fulfill the will of history, or I fulfill the will of my class, or I understand myself to be a member of a certain economic stratum, let us say, which I didn't choose, but with which I'm deeply bound up, which I cannot, in a sense, help and don't want to help, because that's what I am.
In this sense, that really the sociologists are right to a degree, aren't they? That, in fact, many of the ideas, and probably the majority of our ideas, are formed to justify, to rationalize the functions which we have in society. That is, they're thrown up by society. They're not uniquely divined notions that an individual arrives at, but they are ideas which are formulated by the society in order that the individuals will be able to act, and that the ideas come, in a sense, after the action and don't precede it.
Well, there's obviously much truth in this, and I don't think it's done consciously. I don't think this justifying activity is done by a lot of unscrupulous knaves who simply throw dust in people's eyes in order to make them do what they want them to do, although Voltaire thought something like that. I dare say there have been cases of that. But broadly speaking, what one can say is ideas are not born in the void. Ideas are not born of ideas. There's no pathogenesis among ideas. Ideas are, to a large extent, the products of the social process. I'd be the last person to deny that. Take, for example, nationalism, which is one of the most rampant ideas at present in the world, as who can deny? Well, this is to a high degree the product, for example, of, I suppose, humiliation on the part of the weak by the strong, which ultimately leads to a backlash, which ultimately leads to a kind of what Schiller and other people have called the bent twig theory. If you bend the twig too far, it lashes back. Well, I don't think they're conscious of that. I think if you talk about nationalists, they don't say, we've been humiliated, we've been pushed aside, we've not been given our place in the sun, and that's why we feel so resentful. We are poor and we hate the rich because we're poor. We have been weak and that's why we hate the strong, because we're weak. They just feel these emotions, which are undoubtedly caused in them by some kind of socio-psychological process.
In a sense, then, we are determined.
To a large degree. To begin with, of course, let us admit one thing. A lot of things which were regarded as free in the past are now seen to be conditioned by external circumstances, and we've become, in that sense, more enlightened, and if you like, more forgiving in an anti-Kantian sort of way. People were blamed for doing all kinds of things which can now be seen they probably can't help because of bad education or because of terrible social pressures.
But is there a danger of swinging in the other direction too far?
Yes, yes, I would say there was. I would say there was. Nevertheless, if you exaggerate this and make it absolutely total, then you have a picture of totally moldable, malleable men who can be turned into almost anything, which is rather what the 18th century French philosophers believed. And that really does deny any meaning to a very large number of moral terms, which we would then have to shed. We'd have to transform our concepts and language in very drastic ways to meet that. Take, for example, the phrase, serve him right. For someone like Skinner, this is a meaningless phrase. What does it mean, serve him right? A man digs a hole for his enemy to fall into and falls into it himself. People feel some satisfaction about this and say, serve him right, very quite right. Poetic justice. Here is a villain who means nothing but harm to a lot of people, and one of the traps which he sets for other people actually catches him. Why do we feel satisfaction at this? Not just at the fact that a bad man has been eliminated. We feel he deserves punishment. The idea of desert is a very obscure idea. If you begin talking about desert, I think you must somewhat abandon the idea of complete determination. Desert means you could have acted otherwise, in which case you would have been all right. But you chose freely to do this, and that's why you don't deserve to be treated in this and that way. Desert implies the possibility of free choice as a central factor, as a central element in human experience. Action as something which is not fully determined.
The problem, though, is that if you have a concept of our being determined, that is the Skinner argument, that is, in fact, we can know, that some all-knowing, omniscient psychiatrist or behavioral therapist can sort of have us taped, that in a way we are undermined, that if society can say, yes, we can help you, we can cure you of all the problems, there is that sense in which you undermine the important ingredient out of which freedom seems to arise, and that is autonomy. Now the question is, in the general notion of human nature, and also in our social institutions, do you think that this concept of autonomy is being lost?
Well, in totalitarian and authoritarian societies, of course. This is really, in a way, stimulated by all the, I don't say stimulated by these doctrines, but the doctrines are symptomatic of an attitude that men are malleable, wholly malleable, that they are made as they are by certain external factors, but that I can interfere with these factors by substituting my own factors, and that I can really turn a human being into practically anything I choose, within certain limits. And this, of course, gives enormous power to the conditioners and entails a high degree of not only malleability, but makes it possible for people to become victims of, no doubt, ill-intentioned or mad or power-seeking or other power-loving and power-using persons. That's what, of course, what Kant protested against. He thought paternalism was a terrible tyranny. even where the paternalist ruler or conditioner is very benevolent, because the implication is you don't understand yourself. I, the psychiatrist, do. I understand both myself and you. You understand neither yourself nor me. You resist because you don't understand. I must therefore somehow break your resistance. I'm kindly, and I don't propose to do this by brutal means, but I shall do it all the same. I know what is good for you and you do not. I shall therefore make you happy, whether you want to be happy or not, in the only way in which people can be made happy, which I happen to know because I've studied the subject and I know all the factors involved. When you are happy, when I've finished with you, you will retrospectively be grateful to me for having done to you what at the time you resisted. Now, in the case of children, we do that a little bit. I mean, we send children to school, although they may, of course, resist, because we say they must be taught to be adult. They must be able to cope with the universe. They won't unless I do. And when they've grown up, they will see that I acted rightly. But to treat large populations as if they were childish, as if they were unadult, that is, of course, the case against imperialism. A large number of imperialists were benevolently motivated. They thought, here were these poor natives, here are we, civilized people. We can't listen to what they want. What they want is neither here nor there. It's what we know is good for them. Never mind what they think. This does open the doors to the most fearful tyranny, not less tyrannous, because sometimes it's used by people full of goodwill and full of Skinnerian conviction.
To sum up then, how do you think that notions like there being a human nature, how do you think these have formulated the ideologies of our time?
Let me make it absolutely plain. I think that rational scientific attitudes are entirely good. That the more we know, the better. That the only way in which we can lead sane and happy, and if you like, moral lives, is by understanding ourselves as well as possible. Anything which makes for self-understanding is a good thing. But of course you can not only misinterpret, you can use scientific data for purposes which some of us would disapprove of. Darwin never preached social Darwinism. Darwin merely formulated a theory according to which certain species survived and certain species didn't, in accordance with certain natural laws. To apply that to human competition and say, devil take the hindmost, the only people who are worth saving are the toughest, the cleverest, and most ruthless, because they are the fittest, is a misapplication of what was a perfectly good biological theory which didn't dictate any particular specific form of behavior. You might say, even if you were Darwin, there are certain forms of life which do not make for survival, but which nevertheless we value. Saintliness, benevolence, disinterestedness, all kinds of extreme purity of heart may expose the people who have it to being crushed and eliminated by the strong, the wicked, and the ruthless. Nevertheless, we wish to support these people so long as it is possible to do so. We wish to organize a society which will prevent the pike from eating the carp. In nature, pike do eat carp, but we will create artificial conditions in which the carp will survive because we're pro-carp. Anyhow, because we think the rights of carp are as good as the rights of pike, and the strong mustn't eat up the weak. This is not incompatible with anything which we regard as being a law of biological survival. The whole doctrine of Huxley, for example, who talked about nature being red in tooth and claw, is we must resist nature, not cooperate with her. That he wanted to deny that nature was benevolent and meant well. He wanted to say nature was a cold, ruthless, cruel affair, so to speak, which is not interested in individuals. It has no moral content at all. This is what goes on in the world, but to be a human being is to have certain moral ideals, in which case we must resist natural processes in the way in which lions and tigers can't. And therefore, what you call ideology, I think, can be made independent of scientific findings. Although scientific findings furnish the evidence of what you want to do, goals are not provided by science.